If you have any, the idea is that we're going to have a conversation across the floor. If you have any, if you found anything that Samar has said interesting and you want to hear more, if you have any questions in particular.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk, and I'm very sorry for what happened to you.
I'm over it now, thank you.
Yeah, well,
that's why I can talk about it.
I wondered, I was interested in what you said about emancipation theology, and you talked at the end about theoretical tools, but is the general consensus that there's a need to down theological tools? Has anyone productively returned to the tafsir tradition of interpreting the Quran to, because I know that Islamic feminists have often prematurely dismissed that whole tradition of interpreting the Quran, assuming that it's always been patriarchal when it actually, the evidence suggests otherwise. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Many thoughts on that. So one aspect of emancipation theology is to reinterpret the tradition and not assuming that it has always been patriarchal or homophobic. And that's the work of Islamic feminists like Amina Wadud, for example, is to reread it. My work, I'm really interested in fiqh scholars from 1,000 years ago, from the period of Al-Andalus or even before that, who articulated readings of the Quran and scripture that are in favor of gender and sexual diversity. I think the first thing that you said was, I think the importance of emancipation theology is that it's going to help somebody for whom scripture is important. I think for me personally, that's my motivation in pursuing it. But actually, when you do look into the Quran, you'll find that even the traditional interpretations, they're not as well grounded as one would have. It's because you take something for granted that it must be true, but you actually sit there and look at it and go through the mathematics of it. It doesn't add up. And I think that's why that conversation is very difficult to have, because you are standing up against eons of understanding and schools of thought that have closed the book on this particular subject. It's like, it's a given, it's 2 + 2 = 4, what do you mean? And then you go, but it's not 2 and + 2, right? It's something else. And when you look at the, same with consumption of alcohol. If you look at the Quran, it also depends on your methodology. If you want to specifically just look at the Quran, there is no verse in the Quran that absolutely forbids, restricts, punishes the consumption of alcohol. There's a suggestion that you shouldn't, it begins with, that you shouldn't drink alcohol before you pray. Then it says there are a number of things you should avoid because they are the work of the devil, and one of them is alcohol. To avoid, I don't know how the word avoid, ishtanibuh, became to be, but this is a very sensitive topic, and it's, I couldn't remember the first thing that you said about,
I think I was talking about, that you talked about theoretical ways through.
Yes.
But I was just wondering about theological ways through. If there's some way of embracing Islam through returning to the entire tafsir tradition.
Absolutely.
Because this is the problem with Islamic feminism, that some early attempts at just assuming that it was always already patriarchal, when actually people like Sharut Naguib have very productively found many instances of where key interpreters of the Quran have gone out of their way not to interpret certain surah in patriarchal ways. Mm-hmm. So
I guess there's a difference between a Muslim feminist and an Islamic feminist. Mm-hmm. So we probably have different terminology in the way that the term Islamic feminism operates for me in a North American context. Yeah. So I mean women who are engaged with the tradition and with the scripture, whereas Muslim feminists who dismiss that. So it does exist for sure. In fact, I'm hoping to work with an Islamic feminist very soon on a project where we're going to revisit the tradition, the scripture, and really, for once and for all, get down into the nitty-gritty of it and work out a chronology for when these prohibitions began to emerge in a way that we can understand them as referring to modern homosexuality. Because initially what the reference was for Qawm Lut, liwat, was specifically in relation to an act of sodomy that was in context of, it was a punitive context, punishment, right? So we want to know when that then turned into the modern understanding of sexual orientation or sex for desire. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hello. Yeah, I was just saying that was very, very interesting.
Can you please speak into the microphone? I'm slightly deaf, so yeah, thank you.
Can everyone hear me?
Much better.
Yeah, I found that very interesting talk. You covered a lot of area. I think it's like hard to even mention it specifically, but yeah, I found to add on what she said. I think that from my experiences when I have talked to in a mosque to an actual scholar, like someone who says he's a scholar, is that I think that when it comes to homosexuality specifically, I think there is a disconnect in discourse. I mean, if you would look back in the West, they use how is people who are from the Middle East or Islamic jurisprudence and the scholars who are in consensus, they seem to consider homosexuality a behavior. Like when they hear the word, they only relate to behavior, not identity.
They only relate to the. If I turn this up, is it going to kill me? Okay, go on.
Okay. With my experiences from talking to scholars, they seem to relate only to behavior.
Oh, behavior. Yeah. Behavior is opposed to identities?
Yes.
Right.
And then this is something that used to be the case as well in the West, but that discourse was changed after they is considered first to be, okay, this is something you attract as an illness, and then later it became more of a human right when they discovered, no, it's not an illness. So, would you not say that that is essentially the problem more so rather than directly scripture, since people interpret scripture to the narrative and discourse?
Well, it depends. That's a really good question. It's a great question. So the first thing we have to think is, well, what is the scripture describing? The scripture is describing behavior. It's not describing identities, right? And that was the consistent understanding back then. And today you have, when you have certain theologians who are in favor of punishment for homosexuality or the prohibition of homosexuality, one of the main arguments is that it is still a behavior they don't recognize. So that was the type A typology. They don't recognize it as an identity, right? You were all born heterosexual, and if you're deviating from that path.
Okay, yeah? I'll just add on, personally, I would see it as probably in almost the same way. But what I find very hard is to go out and say that, what I find very hard to say is that, yes, it's true that they see it in that way, in the sense that, oh, this is something you should be punished, it's something that's strictly behavior. But then when I look really at who really gets to say, when I look at the whole tradition of our consensus of the scholars, the tradition of the hadith when it comes to Sunni, for instance, specifically, it seems to be that there is no clear-cut way of this person definitely has the authority to say what Islam is, and this person has definitely not the authority to say that. I think the slight difference between Islam and Christianity and some other religions, where they might have clergymen that directly transcribes the information of this is what the divine message is, but in Islam it's God directly to you as the reader. So I think that's the main, my main question would be, if we were to assume that no one can really represent, or we don't know who is really representing Islam, how would we be able to change this, I would say, conservative or this discourse in homosexuality being related to behavior? How would we be able to change it with having this mindset of
so, like you said, Islam is kind of a rhizome rather than a root. It operates kind of laterally, right? There is no hierarchy of authority and of traditional interpretation, but that's also not quite true, because then you have your Al-Azhar, for example. You have Mecca as a site of Islam. You have, I was going to say the Shah. That'd be very funny. You have the supreme leader in Iran. So we like to think of Islam as sort of a lateral kind of spread. That's one thing. That's not entirely true. So you do have centers of power that produce knowledge and that claim authority. Al-Azhar is definitely one of those. However, on the other hand, how do you change that perspective? I don't have any aspirations to see a fundamental institutional change in my lifetime. I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime. But what I can provide, and what emancipation theology provides, is the information for people who are seeking it, right? So those students who are going to go and do their own ijtihad, right, who are going to look for the scripture for themselves. And one of the most successful ways of controlling a population and radicalizing it is to convince them that they do not have either the authority or the knowledge or the skill to be able to interpret scripture themselves. And that's you create a monopoly of knowledge, right, that resides in a particular religious leader, and that religious leader can then just make up whatever they want, and they do. I've seen it happen. And when you don't know an answer, you just make up an answer so that you don't look like you don't know what you're talking about. You never say, I don't know, for some reason. I think it's a mark of a good teacher to say, I have no idea, right? And some people refrain from that. And it exists, and it's quite frightening. So I think to answer your question, how do you change people's perceptions? You provide that space in which they can struggle with what they think, with the God that they've come to understand. And then you also provide the alternative readings, the alternative literature, and you provide that exact notion that this is a tradition of discussion, right? Currently there's 5 different schools of thought. Across Islamic history, we've had dozens more. There's so many different schools of thought. Once you situate Islam historically across a range of geographies and ways of thinking, then you are no longer sort of incarcerated, as I say, by a specific perspective. So the more you read, the freer you're going to be. And so our job is really to provide alternative ways of seeing, right? Yeah.
Thank you so much. Ipek?
Okay. Thank you very much for your talk.
It's my pleasure.
I really
Thank you.
enjoyed it too. I want to claim a little bit role for sociology back again, because in your talk, you kind of, as I understand it, you offered the theology, emancipated theology, and kind of as some sort of a solution. But I kind of want to make a little bit more space for something else, in the sense that actual sociological research, when they've carried out, for example, in UK, which it can show room for optimism in the sense that not kind of by doing big surveys, that measure people's, homophobic attitudes, blah, blah. But for example, research that looks at clash between second generation and first generation Muslims and so on. It shows that, let's say about partner choice or the hijab and so on and so forth, social actors are very creative. So what they found is that actually the newer generation, they actually make a distinction between their parents' culture and their religion. And they make that distinction, and in a way that they then turn this around and play it against their parents, in a way. So they create room for themselves, and they kind of bring in their own faith and kind of this, in their own interpretation, what you were talking about there. And the things they don't like are then can be associated with their parents' culture, which should stay where they are, because these children, they say they are British in that sense. So I kind of welcome this sort of creativity, obviously, and just wanted to mention that. Probably you're aware of this.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I love that. That's so subversive. That's exactly what we see in that mini-series. The kids really, it's a very fun kind of show for that. That's great. That's terrific. Thank you for sharing that.
Okay, anybody else? Yeah.
I'm waiting for him to come on.
We're doing a lot of exercise today.
I'm really bad with these. I apologise, I'm really bad with these. I really like that. I really just want to say I really like the stuff you were saying about getting caught in the liberal position, the intersectional position. There's lots of stuff about the Irish wrote about that in the 1970s as well. But that's not the question I want to ask. The question I want to ask is, what did you mean by queer? Because as you were using it, it kept slipping away from me.
I know, it slipped away from you.
I thought, aha, she means this type of queer. Yeah. And it's not my queer.
It's not your queer.
And then I thought, but I've pinned it down. She means a certain kind of diasporic, probably slightly well-dressed, kind of Arab gay man that I've met. And I've probably chatted him up. Oh no, it's not him, because he doesn't go to Pride Festival. He doesn't like Pride Festival because he doesn't like white men. And then it came back again, and then I thought, no, I still don't know, because it was losing me.
Yes, that's
but it was clear you had a very definite idea,
yes.
and I kind of needed to know because it wasn't my idea of queer.
I love that. I love
Do you know what I mean?
that.
So I thought I need to pin her down on this one.
You got it.
Okay.
That's a beautiful question. I love it. Exactly. So this is not a queer that's politically queer in a conscious kind of way. We're post-gay now. Gay is too normalized. We're anti. We're not doing neoliberal economics, so now we're queer. It's not that. And it's not queer fashionable dresses very nicely either. What is queer here? Queer here, very simply, we're talking about a population of individuals that can't be described as heterosexual. That's it. So it's the non-heterosexuals, the gender and sexually variant person, irrespective of how much they're in acceptance of that, how much they might look like the liberal subject, white male, irrespective of the socio-economic class that they might inhabit. So we are really just talking about not straight people, right? So that's it. Really, that's how this particular word operates in this specific context, in this literature. Because we can't even call them gay and lesbian, because some of them don't even want to identify as gay and lesbian. Some of them don't even want to identify as queer. They're just not heterosexual. So in this particular word, it's a catch-all phrase for all of that. It's a place for the politically engaged queer, so some really vocal members of Iman, for example, who quite consciously have a political position. It also includes the person who's like Tawfiq, the Moroccan French performance artist who's out and all that, that sort of thing. But it includes people who don't identify as queer, who have issue with gay and lesbian because now it stigmatizes them, so they'd rather not call it anything. And they'd rather not call it queer either, but we need to identify them, so we need to give them a name. So it's that. But that's a beautiful question. I saw you shaking your head. I'm like, oh my God. What did I say?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samar. That was great. I had a question. I'm from the Netherlands. And yes, I know we're sort of known for our tolerance and multiculturalism, but what a lot of people don't know is actually that there's also like 5 until 10% like real Bible belt holding on to scripture and Bible.
Especially in the last 15 years.
Yeah, so I was wondering, because I see like similarities within that population, and I do think what you say as well is knowing that it's not purely in religious groups that homosexuality can be considered to be problematic. So I think that is very right, but I sort of see that struggle of finding ways of people to maintain some sense of what they want in their religiosity and finding peace with their sexual identity as well within the Christian, like the sort of Christian gay community in Holland. So I see a lot of overlap, and I was wondering, whereas I do totally think that Muslim queer people are entitled to their own spaces, I was also thinking, like, is there anything, like, as far as you know, like some sort of finding bridges together? Because especially if you compare Christian and Islam, it's like the same story that actually sort of condemns homosexuality. So I was wondering if there are, like, except for these, like, Yusuf and Salam, like these Islamic gay-friendly places, whether there are also bridges between, like, the sort of people who come from a strict Christian background and who are struggling with finding means to maintain their faith and maintain their identity.
I don't think that, to my knowledge, that there isn't anything substantial. It's all really just cursory, so we can sit at the table together and look nice and friendly and a pluralistic society.
Yeah.
Right. But there are, like what I talked about in the lecture earlier was that example in 2013 when, what was it called? I don't want to get the name wrong because this is being filmed and I'm a scholar and I can't get things wrong. But when the largest body that represents Muslims in the US voted on ENDA, they are called Islamic Society of North America, right? So they voted on ENDA. This was a bill to end discriminatory acts in the workplace, right? You can't discriminate against somebody based on gender and sexuality. Now they voted on that. That's great. That was in 2013. And there was Khan's research as well. She interviewed 55 people, heterosexual, gay and lesbian, and I don't remember exactly if there were transgender subjects in that study, but she did find that there was a dialogue going on, and it was taking place as a result of these agitations. So in the US context, something's changing. The Pew Center research went from 27% acceptance tolerance rate to 39% from 2007 to 2011. Something is happening there. Okay, that's really good. 39%, I'll take that. 4 out of 10 people, I'll take it. And also, but how, you know, if you want to be really cynical, we can say that the Islamic Society of North America voted on this bill because they want the same protection rights as a religious minority. So it wasn't that they cared about gender and sexual minorities, it's that they're a racial minority and they want the same protections. But I don't really want to go and be that cynical. Now, I do think there is a relationship between multiculturalism, a society that has at some point in its imagination fathomed that it was multicultural, whether that was true or not, and a more informed queer space or LGBT space, that they're more kind of politically attuned. I do think that that's... Yeah, in the Netherlands, I know it's probably not good enough for you, but trust me, if I had a choice between the Netherlands and Australia, I know where I would go.
No, but it's much more that I sort of noticed that in Holland, like, the focus is on, like, Islamophobia and Islam not being inclusive, whereas I come from this strict Christian background, and I sort of feel like, okay, but we're so measuring with different measures because we're looking with our magnifying glasses to the Islam because it's scary and it's foreign, whereas if you look in this strict Christian angle, it's completely the same.
Yes.
But we don't mention it.
Yeah. So
and I do think that and then like the main approach towards it is to sort of be against religion, which doesn't help these people who are in that position because they feel they have to choose, and so that is much more what annoys me. It's not the lack of space in the Netherlands per se, but it's much more the very fact that we call out Islam, but we don't call out other religions. And then, like, and if we call out religions, then
because in the Netherlands, Christianity, that's just they're us, they're a part of us. But this is a foreign. It's the same thing with the Jewish experience in Europe. It was never really seen as an organic part of European. Of the European population. I shouldn't say never, but shouldn't say never. That's not true either.
Right, and we've got time. Well, we're running out of time, but 2 last burning questions.
I have all the time in the world. Seriously.
I hope I put this right too, because I'm also having problems with microphones.
You just hold it really close, because you know I'm partially deaf. So.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. And I will derive my question from a small point in your introduction about populations that are misread as Muslims. And you mentioned the Arab and Sikhs, and I would focus on Arabs. So I was also looking at your book, Female Homosexuality in the Middle East or something. So I was wondering if, what about the now we were talking about multicultural, multi-religious context. So what about other cultures in the Middle East and maybe Northern Africa? I would like just an example, because I am curious to know how they're doing, the Christians in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean. So how are they dealing with this topic? I'm curious.
Well, you know, my area of research is on Muslims, so it's not like I can answer that question, but I can answer it as a person, as somebody who was born into a very, 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 very secular household, but culturally Christian, you know. When my sister got married, she got married in a church. That's probably as many times as I've been in the church whenever my sister's married. So, you know, I can't answer that as a scholar. But what I can tell you, why am I studying Islam? Because in the Arab world, as you would understand, we share the same heritage of being from Bilad al-Sham, is that for us, it's not just a religion, it's a history, it's a language, it's a civilizational issue. And currently, right now, the attention isn't on Arabs. We are being read as Muslims, and that's where the battleground is. And the other thing is funding language. Don't underestimate, universities are not investing money in Arab studies. It's the burning question now, Islam this, Islam that, and it's awful, right? And I would love to address all the various minorities, right, and look at this from a secular perspective. But that hasn't been the trajectory of my research. I didn't choose to become a lecturer in gender and Islamic studies. There was a university that got funding based on a grant from the government to institute a center of excellence in Islamic studies, which obviously wasn't so excellent because I'm no longer in it. But, you know, that's why I became, when I wrote Female Homosexuality in the Middle East, I'm glad you pointed that out, Islam was operated very differently to the way my research came to be punctuated once I was institutionalized and I had to be funneled through this, oh, let's pour some money on understanding this terrible thing called Islam, right? And so that's kind of what pushed me to specialize specifically in Islam, but I stayed loyal to the Arab element of that because that's what I can connect to on a linguistic and cultural level. I don't know very much about Islam in Asia, for example, right? Indian, Pakistani, and Indonesian. The world's biggest Muslim population is Indonesia, right? So that I've been maneuvered institutionally, and then I was when it was too controversial, you know, now on my own. But that's it. It's done. It's done, and I'm very passionate about the work and grateful for that opportunity. And yeah.
Right. We have one last question. Because we started 5 minutes late, so we might as well make the most of the time. Before we all leave and before we thank Samar again, we take your feedback very seriously. So please do have a look at that feedback form we've given you, and you know, tell us if we've stimulated your thought about this particular topic. Thank you very much. This is the last question.
Okay, thank you. I've got the honor to ask the last question. I'll be very quick. I really enjoyed your talk and I wanted to make a comment rather than a question. I've done similar research on Italian, Canadian, Italian American writing by lesbian and gays and transgender writers, and I found that there was a lot of material that you covered that resonates with my study. And what I really want to say is important in diasporic communities to think about also the logic of rejection of some and rejection and integration of feelings, ideas, and thoughts. For example, in my case. The writings that I work with talked about the fact that as a lesbian and Italian, Italian-Canadian or Italian-American in the US and in Canada, you couldn't really be Italian anymore. So you had either to choose between, you know, belongings. Either you were a lesbian or you were Italian. So when these writers enter the communities, LGBT communities, lesbian communities, they couldn't find that part that they had rejected. So there was a need really of something in between. And I think in the diasporic community, this need is quite high, and these are places that can really bring creative ways in which we can also reinterpret discourses that can be, in this case, religious, because in my case we were talking about Catholicism. And so in this case, in the case of the writings, there was a lot of ways in which these women wanted to reintegrate it and racialize themselves as Italians, as black olives, for example, in the white community, which had erased the kind of also emotions, traditions, and of course Catholicism was part of that for some of them. So I think I really enjoy the fact that you talk about revisionism and emancipatory theology, because I'm also dealing with translation and I've got a lot of Muslim students, and yesterday we talked about retranslation of the Quran. I know there's a project that I've looked into that by a group of women in Malaysia, and these women don't talk about the fact that Quran is necessarily sexist or patriarchal, is showing patriarchal language, but they basically say that there's a need to reinterpret something that was misinterpreted in some passages. So I think it's important to think about that space in between that you talked about today, and ways in which we can place ourselves.
The common narrative is walking away. You have to choose one or the other. And from if I were to reflect that on that personally, and I'm not even religious, right? I didn't have a religious crisis of identity. My crisis of identity was just, it's like, oh my God, everybody hates gay people, and I'm gay. So, and yet what you do is you do reject your culture. You walk away from that, and you think that that's the answer. But at some stage, and I think this was really for me, it was the moment when I started doing my research for my PhD, which was I was trying to locate same-sex love in Arabic literature and Arabic history and Arabic civilization. Was there a place for me, or am I a product of growing up in Australia? So we moved to Australia when I was 11. Is there a place for me in this history, among these people, or am I really just westernized? And that's when I realized that I'd robbed myself of an entire heritage under the false pretense that I'm a product of 19th century pathologization. I'm a modern lesbian subject produced by 19th century pathologization, according to Foucault. And for me, I was like, hell no, I'm going back and I'm claiming this. This is mine. And and that's interesting, because my people used to mispronounce my name. They'd call me Samar, Samar, Samar. And I'm like, and I was 19 years old when I turned around. Well, actually, no, I was about 25. But 19 was when I started to say to people, it's Samar. And now everybody who gets it wrong, I correct them. Because for me, it's about claiming the place, my rightful place in my heritage. They can't take that away from me, because I've done the research. I know I come from a long line of woman-loving women from the Arab world. So, yeah.
Very optimistic note to end it. Well, I'm going to end by doing what I should have done first, which is introducing myself. I'm Dr Alberto Fernández Carbajal. I'm a Leverhulme Fellow at the School of English. And I'm sure you agree with me, it's been a great opening for the Queer in Islam series. So let's thank Samar for the